Okay, hello everyone. My name is Kevin. I'm the training coordinator with the Association of State Floodplain Managers, and I'd like to welcome you to our event this afternoon. Today we're going to be talking about federal policy issues. It's our March 2026 National Policy Briefing. Um, so just to kind of set the table before we get into our agenda today, want to let everybody know this session is being recorded and we can provide the recording to you in about a week or so, sometimes a little bit less, but sometimes it takes up to a week. So if you miss something or if we move too fast, you just want to reference this later on, the recording is going to be made available to you. We also have a Q&A section of the Zoom interface here. If you have any questions you want answered today or just any comments, if you could please put those in the Q&A section as opposed to the chat section, I would really appreciate it. We'll take as many questions as we can as time allows. Um, this is a high level briefing. We're not offering any CECs for this, and we have 30 minutes set aside. So we'll try to keep within that 30-minute time frame. We do have a lot to get to though. So to that end, I want to introduce Elizabeth Duffy from our policy team, and she's going to be telling us agenda item number 1, updates from DC. So Elizabeth, take it away when you're ready.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. Greetings from Washington, D.C., where it is a beautiful day today. Cherry blossoms are just shy of peak, so it's gorgeous down around the tidal basins and the Capitol buildings, and Congress is crazy. So we're still in a shutdown for the DHS appropriations for FY26. We're in day 41 of that shutdown. Congress is set to recess on at the end of this week for 2 weeks. And if they do not resolve this DHS funding issue, we will carry forward with a unfunded DHS for another 2 weeks. So right now where we are is the compromise between what the Democrats are seeking and what the Republicans are offering has pretty much stalled. The House and the Senate are voting again today on some version of DHS funding. The Senate Republicans delivered to the Senate Democrats their quote, last and final offer at noon today. And they had a vote on the floor at 2 o'clock to move forward and debate and move forward to voting on the bill. And that just failed a few minutes ago. But I just read a report that said Schumer and Thune are talking again at 2:45. They were scheduled to talk again and possibly see if they could bring the bill back to the floor for a vote later today. Senator Thune has indicated that he may delay the Senate's departure for its 2 weeks recess if they're close to coming to an agreement to fund DHS. The House was voting on a third version of the DHS funding bill, and it just collapsed on the floor as well. They've held it over. The House Democrats tried to force a vote on legislation to fund DHS minus ICE funding, but that fell short of the 218 votes needed to advance it to the floor last night. So just as an FYI, this is not a typical appropriations fight. It's not about funding levels. This has become a proxy battle over immigration enforcement policy and the differences between the two parties on that issue. So where we stand right now is the DRF is operating on, I believe, on immediate needs. I believe the balance is just under 6 billion in the DRF right now. We know that NFIP is flooded through to, or sorry, NFIP is reauthorized through the end of the fiscal year, so September 30th. So we're okay with that right now. Um, we are awaiting FY27 appropriations, so we're expecting the president's budget request next week on the 31st. But whispers are starting to say that it may be delayed up to 2 weeks due to this holdup on the DHS shutdown right now. The president's budget request usually comes out in February, so it's very much delayed this year. And it's typically a reflection of the administration's priorities and objectives. So we expect to see a budget that codifies the staffing cuts that have been made, the program rescissions that were enacted in last year, and also any agency restructuring that they have put forth. That budget will give us an opportunity then to have hard numbers that we can push back against as far as funding for our mitigation programs, flood mapping, and et cetera. Republicans are also now talking more openly on a second reconciliation package this year. The reconciliation that they did last year basically codified the tax cuts that were put in place and set to expire at the end of the 25 calendar year. These efforts for a reconciliation must be budgetary in nature. So we might see them add things like voter ID and how you would fund a voter ID. And if this DHS shutdown continues, they may try to pull some of the DHS funding into a reconciliation bill as well. So all of this focus on the tremendous time that it's been taking to move these appropriations bills forward has really slowed movement on any authorizing legislation like NFIP reform and reauthorization. We've been informed by staffers that it's highly unlikely that we will see an NFIP reform bill this Congress. Um, and it's also appears that on the Senate side, efforts for an NFIP reform that were led by Senator Rounds and Senator Kennedy have stalled. And Senate banking staff has informed us that they're unsure if a bill will be moved this year at all as well. But we'll continue to monitor legislation that's around flooding bills and also around the efforts to reform FEMA, that House Transportation and Infrastructure bill that has moved to the House, a desk ready to be voted on by the House floor. So far in the Senate, efforts haven't yielded a companion bill on the Senate side, but we're watching and working with staff on that as well. But members of Congress are continuing to introduce bills that are relevant to flooding and flood issues. We're expecting to see a bill from Senator Whitehouse and Senator Tillis today on elevating properties out of flood risk. It's a bill that we were very excited to see them move forward. So we are continuing to work with members of Congress and their staff to bring forward legislation that has a positive impact. It's just that we're running out of legislative time and calendar to move these bills through the committee process to their respective chambers for a vote and then get them through Congress before we recess in December. And lastly, we are starting to get ready for the midterm elections, which will be in November. The primary season is upon us. This also takes a tremendous amount of the elected members' time, and they will be out of their offices for the entire month of July, as well as the entire month of August for the entire month of August and the entire month of October for campaigning. So again, that also impinges on our ability to see legislation move all the way through the process. So it's a little bit crazy here, but we've got beautiful weather. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was great. Our next item, DHS leadership change. And for that, we have our executive director, Chad Berginnis. So, Chad, go ahead when you're ready.
All right. Good afternoon, Kevin and everyone. So as of earlier this week, DHS has a new secretary, Secretary Mark Wayne Mullen, and wanted to kind of talk a little bit about what Mr. Mullen may or may not bring to the position that way, and then also a little bit of some of the priorities as we kind of see them. But Mr. Mullen has been most recently a senator from the state of Oklahoma, was also a congressional rep there as well. And as soon as that, one of the things that as soon as I heard that he had been nominated, I reached out to a colleague in Oklahoma to get a better sense of his how he's kind of interacted with FEMA and those programs and those kinds of state things. And one of the responses that kind of stuck in my head from my colleague was, Oklahoma is one of the most disaster-prone states of the country, and he happened to come from the most disaster-prone district in that state. So he's aware of FEMA. He knows he's knows FEMA's programs, to the extent a member of Congress can. And, the feeling is that he could be a positive, certainly a positive influence leading DHS when it comes to FEMA issues. And I say that because certainly there's been some other, concerns and things about, issues not related to FEMA with Mr. Mullen and how things might pan out there. But I was also encouraged by some of the comments in the confirmation hearing, especially when asked point blank about doing away with the $100,000 contract limit, which he said that he would do. But one of the other comments that struck me was the fact that acknowledging he doesn't have to be the smartest person in the room, but he happens to be a pretty good manager. And as long as he hires competent people to do their job, that is what his focus is. And so we can certainly hope that that is, that is indeed the case. Another colleague pointed out to me that, it was back in the late spring that Cameron Hamilton, in a congressional hearing, dared mention that FEMA should exist and promptly got fired. And yet, Mr. Mullen, when being asked during his confirmation hearing about, FEMA and FEMA function and some of their importance and everything, not only acknowledged that it needs to be there, but even if it's changed, and now he's the DHS secretary. So all of that to say that we certainly have some hopes that some change can happen, and it can't happen soon enough. And one of the things I just want to kind of briefly mention that's related to this is there are probably some very, very short-term priorities that need to be addressed at FEMA. And one of those that I think is flying under the radar, especially cumulatively, is kind of what I'm going to call the contract cliff that is really upon us. In March, we've seen the lapse of the CRS contract earlier in March, and by the end of the month, we will also see lapse in some of the major contracts in the NFIP, including things like the PTS Standard Operations contract. There's also a Standard Operations contract on the insurance side. There's a pivot contract. There's some contracts in March for MT1 and MT2. There are a lot of contracts which need to be extended or otherwise, allowed to function, or else, for all intents and purposes, there's going to be a lot of functions of the NFIP that are going to be hampered. And I know that one of the questions that we had come already through the Q&A, specific to the CRS contract, is that the contractor in place for that has described a number of impacts to CRS communities that would happen. We happen to be in possession of a reply to a state who had inquired to FEMA about those impacts. And interestingly, FEMA has said that that is not true and that everything is functioning properly. We would happen to disagree with that assessment from FEMA. I'm not sure if that's their external affairs talking or who, but the math is pretty simple. When you have a very, very small amount of staff at FEMA and contractors doing all the day-to-day work, you can't function as normal that way. However, what we've also kind of understood about the CRS contract, at least to the extent that we know, and again, please understand, FEMA is under a total gag order, blackout from talking to anybody about anything, is that essentially, if you are a CRS community and you have a, let's say, an equivalent of a 15% discount, it is our assumption that discount is continuing. A contract lapse doesn't mean that the program itself is going away. The program is in law. The program is still there, and we think that when this contract issue happens, then the operations of the CRS program will resume that way. And we also had another, I think, question. The relationship between the CRS contract pause and the FEMA budget. That is a little less clear, in terms of the budget. And it does depend, I think, on the funding source at FEMA, because some of FEMA's funds come from policyholder money. And it's those particular funds where certain operations, the NFIP, can continue even when there is a pause in FEMA overall. So I don't have the answer to that necessarily, but that is, nothing can happen operationally there, I think, until we get this contract situation sorted through. So Mr. Mullen has a number of contracting kinds of issues that probably are one of the top priorities initially when it comes to the NFIP. And in kind of tracking some of these, we know that at least as early as last fall, before the federal fiscal year ended, that some of these contracts were sitting on Secretary's gnome desk, and that they did not get signed. So they've run the gamut, and hopefully Mr. Mullen can make a difference there. But again, we will need to pay attention here very closely to the next couple of weeks, because we could see potentially even more impacts to the program if some of these contracting issues are not dealt with. And so we'll be reaching out certainly to Secretary Mullen's staff to alert them on the issues as well, as soon as they get in place there at DHS. So with that, Kevin, I'll turn it back to you. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Chad. And there were a couple of questions in the Q&A that were answered related to that. So thank you for addressing those. For our next item, we're going to be discussing House NFIP hearing. And for that, I believe we have Meg Galloway. Meg is our Senior Policy Advisor here at ASFPM. So Meg, go ahead and take it away when you're ready.
Thanks, Kevin. Hopefully I'll probably try to make this a little bit short because I only got to listen to the first half of the hearing, and we had basically just gotten through the witness testimony. The hearing was in the House Committee on Financial Services, their Committee on Housing and Insurance, and the title of the hearing was Mitigation and Multiple Lost Properties, Factors Influencing the High Cost of Flooding. And they had five people testifying. One was Alicia Puente Cackley, and she is with the Government Accountability Office. Diane Horn, who is with the Congressional Research Service. Steve Ellis, who is the president of Taxpayers for Common Sense. Joel Scada, Natural Resource Defense Council, and Samantha Metlock. And she was speaking for herself. She most recently was with FEMA and has just started her own firm. And I will say that a lot of these people are people that we've worked closely with in the past. From what I've heard, what I heard through the testimony, and I really could not hear many of the question and answer sessions, all witnesses really told similar stories and had complementary recommendations. Most of them talked about flood being the most frequent natural disaster, that the risk is growing, that repetitive loss properties are the greatest cost associated with the cost of flooding. A lot of talk about the low take up of flood insurance. Fact that 2.5% of the flood insurance policies have submitted 48% of the claims, and also that there are so many properties that have been flooded that are outside of the map floodplain. And one figure that was thrown out was 50%. And that people are forced into higher risk areas, usually due to socioeconomic issues or the fact that they don't recognize the flood risk. So, as I said, the focus of the hearing was on multiple lost properties. And some of the common themes were, one is dealing with the flood insurance debt, which I believe right now is at $22.5 billion. Need to better define the risk. And some of the recommendations there was providing better access to data on repetitive loss, and the which is currently has very limited ability to an individual property owner because that it won't be disclosed because of Privacy Act issues. Also, improving real estate disclosure requirements across the country. So when people are looking at buying a property or even renting a property, they can have access to the past flood profile of the property. And then better defining risk also is in improving the mapping standards and the speed at which the nation is remapped. As I think you all know, that there are some areas that have been mapped recently and other areas that are still probably on paper maps from the 80s. But other things that can be so the areas, another area of improvement is insurance, and that everyone said there needs to be actuarial based pricing, which includes recognizing repetitive loss properties, but that needs to be paired with mean tested affordability. The updating the minimum standards, which have not been updated in quite a while. If several years ago, ASFPM and Natural Resource Defense Council did a request, submitted a request for FEMA to do that, and we understand FEMA was working on it, but with the administration change, we believe that has been set aside. Another issue is long-term reauthorization of the NFIP, and then some of the issues that they talked about with mitigation is the risk is growing faster than the available funding. That the multiple agencies that do flood hazard mitigation need to better coordinate and make it easier to pair funding. There's very little data on the current effectiveness of the mitigation programs. And then the final one that I think most people would agree with is improving the speed and making accessing the mitigation funding simpler. And I probably could go on and on, but Kevin, I'll pass it back to you.
Okay, thank you, Meg. That was really helpful. Our next agenda item, we have SBA final rule outcome, and we're going back to Chad for that. So, Chad, please tell us about the SBA rule. Chad, if you might be
Sorry,
still on.
I lost track of the unmute button.
There you go.
Okay, so this is something that has been on our agenda for I believe a couple months now, but we wanted to kind of, at least for the time being, put a bow on it, and at least let folks know that as of today, it does sound like, and we heard about this through actually a newspaper, a press article, that this SBA final rule, interim final rule that was issued at the beginning of February, which would essentially allow for SBA disaster loan recipients, provided they met certain conditions, such as completing and submitting a complete permit application for whatever permit they needed to rebuild, that if they hadn't heard anything from 30 days, they could self-certify and just do it without getting any permits, is what the interim final rule basically was focused on. But the administration, since that interim final rule was issued, has basically seemed to have declared victory on the issue. and has indicated that while the original executive order that set this thing into motion said that FEMA should develop some rules as well, that they don't anticipate anything else further being done related to this interim final rule. So as you can imagine, any kind of executive order originating rule that would totally steamroll and preempt state and local permitting processes certainly was a big red flag for us. We had met with SBA officials as well as some of the congressional committees working with the SBA. And the feedback that we got from the SBA officials is that, yes, it exists, but no, we don't even have an enforcement section. There's no way we could possibly enforce this. And so given the most recent declaration by the administration that, they feel like it's done its job, we're in this really weird kind of spot where the rule exists right now in regulation, but it doesn't seem like, the administration is going to do too much further with it. So as we had reported and recommended in a webinar that we had put on related to the final rule, probably the most important thing is that if you at the local level have a disaster loan recipient that either is claiming self-certification and saying they don't need your permits at the state or at the local level, that you talk to your legal counsel and make sure that whatever approach you have is a well-informed one. I can't sit here and say I'm not an attorney, I'm not your legal advisor, but certainly we think that the executive order and the final rule are on very shaky legal ground at best. And you have a duly adopted ordinance and regulations that have a specified permitting process that you have to follow. So our recommendation hasn't really changed on it. But I think until there's maybe more activity out of the administration, this will probably be the last we kind of report on this unless something else changes. With that, I'll turn it back over to you, Kevin. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Chad. We have one agenda item left. We have a couple minutes to get through this agenda item, and we do have some questions. We're going to hold the questions, and we'll see if we end up having time. Otherwise, we'll try to get those answers in writing. So, final agenda item, USACE non-structural program. So for that, we have David Conrad. David is our water policy expert here at ASFPM. So David, take it away whenever you're ready.
Good afternoon. Yes, there were several key developments that we've become aware of that we wanted to report to those of you following policies of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers regarding Corps project planning and the use of non-structural project designs and tools such as buyouts and removals, building elevations and floodproofing, and the following of local and state standards. Rather quietly, on October 6th last year, the Corps issued guidance that Civil Works leadership was calling for what they called a pause in further development of Corps non-structural projects, while the Corps experts considered, first, whether such projects were appropriate for the agency's capabilities, and second, if deemed appropriate, what changes would be needed in Corps procedures to meet laws, regulations, and basic guidance to more uniformly spell out the planning and evaluation processes to determine feasibility of the range of project designs. Since then, the Corps brass has decided to maintain the pause in new feasibility starts and those at early planning or construction stages, but to proceed with 4 pilot projects to examine the problems that arise with differences between non-structural projects and traditional standard structural projects, and what would be done to clarify basic, more uniform or regional type processes for rational approaches. Since then, policies have been announced that the Corps would concentrate its work on large projects generally. The 4 pilot projects are first, Fire Island to Montauk Point. It's in Nassau County, New York, called the Coastal Storm Risk Management Project. It is a $1.7 billion project focused on 83 miles of the Long Island coast and over 200 miles of bay and estuary restoration of the outer Long Island shore. It was first authorized in 1960 as a river in the Rivers and Harbors Act. Was reformulated, Congress did a reformulation authorization in WRDA 2024. It would mitigate, theoretically, 4,400 mostly residential buildings that are in the 10-year floodplain. Current phase 1 that is eligible for this pilot project would be to elevate or floodproof 245 buildings in the towns of Frederick Shores and Mastic Beach, New York. So they're going to be studying procedures for elevation and floodproofing there. The second one was in the city of Norfolk, Virginia, called the Coastal Storm Risk Management Project, which at this point is estimated at a total cost of $6.1 billion. It has storm surge barriers, 9 miles of flood walls and levees, 11 tidal gates, 10 pump stations, and along with that, a series of non-structural projects that include home elevations, basement fills, commercial floodproofing, floodproofing of commercial buildings, and oyster reefs and living shorelines. Many know that Norfolk has among the highest rates of relative sea level rise in the nation. The third one was a Florida Keys coastal storm risk management project that would be aimed at elevating 4,700 residential and dry floodproofing of 1,052 non-residential structures throughout the Keys. And the fourth one is called the Greenbrook Project in central New Jersey, involving primary floodproofing of 240 buildings and 105 elevations. Interestingly, that we have there 45% were residential and 55 were non-residential buildings. So those are the non-structural projects that are now allowed to proceed. Otherwise, most all others will be put on hold for now or at the next obvious stopping point to wait for conclusions from the pilot projects. We are not aware of the time frame for these pilot studies, and they may be drawn out. It seems pretty clear that the Corps is more interested in larger projects rather than those of smaller scales. And issues such as cost, the cost of raising buildings such as slab-on-grade buildings is a notable issue. Seems also that elevations seem to be preferred over buyouts at this point. Well, on February 23rd, just a month ago, Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works, Adam Tell, issued about a dozen memoranda to the Corps seeking a range of analyses, including for non-structural project planning procedures to both assess the federal interest in and evaluate the value of projects for purposes of federal prioritization. Those memoranda can be found at the Corps Planning website and should be read by those of us seeking Corps projects or wanting to know the background. Now, one piece of good news on the non-structural front is that the Corps has recently elevated the Corps' non-structural team on technical assistance by creating a new mandatory Center of Excellence for non-structural projects, which at least at the moment will probably be centered out of the New Orleans district. This does mean that it should have higher visibility within the Corps planning and project implementation hierarchy. The House Transportation Infrastructure Committee and the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee continue to move toward development of a Water Resources Development Act in each house, with the idea of sending a word of bill to the president by year's end. And we'll see. Okay, with that, I think I'll turn it back to Alicia.
All right. Thank you, David. So that's all we have for you today, and we're a little bit over time. So I think if you asked a question, we tried to field that earlier, or you may have that in writing already. But thank you all so much for taking time out of your afternoon to join us, and then to our presenters as well. Really appreciate the overview here. Lots going on, obviously. We'll be back again next month, April 30th. Keep an eye on your inbox. We'll send you the registration link when it's ready, and we'll see you then. Thanks so much, everybody. Take care.